Hey, oh, look at that. We're live.
Okay, take a deep breath. We're live. We've had some technical issues in the offing in the last preparatory minutes. I hope they don't bother us, but now we're here live calling Chris Anderson in, I don't know, where are you?
I am in London, believe it or not, but I'm in Studio B tonight because there seems to be something wrong with Studio A. So,
Oh, it's a good thing you have the facilities to go to Studio B.
I'll head all the way upstairs. So, how about you? You're not in Chicago either, unless you got
No,
new places.
I'm in Brooklyn, New York,
Brooklyn.
and hanging out here for the weekend. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show, and check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live, Chris, watching on replay, or
listening on the History Happy Hour podcast.
Right. We are glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about the British royal family in the years after World War II. Let us know you are here and let us know what you're drinking. And while you're doing that, Chris, I have a little quiz for you.
Okay.
I want to tell you about a place that I visited this week, and I'll show you a picture and I'll see if you can tell me where this is.
Walden Pond.
No, I will tell you that it's in North Carolina.
Oh, Moores Creek Bridge.
It is Moores Creek Bridge.
See, look at that. You're definitely out and about.
The site of a Revolutionary War battle in 1776, February of 1776, and the last Highland broadsword charge. Yes, yeah. And also really, really great story if you check out the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, and the commander of the Loyalists.
Thank you.
Most of whom were Scottish. Was a man named Donald MacDonald. I think his family had a certain sameness in the naming of him. And his wife was Flora MacDonald. And 30, 40 years earlier, she had helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape from the Battle of Culloden. So it's all.
And she realized the error of her ways and decided she was going to stay loyal this time around. Look what that got her.
Yeah, it did not get her very much. She went back to Britain kind of penniless and everything. But listen, before we start the show, also, I want to thank everybody who's joining us as a Patreon patron, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can become a Patreon patron at historyhappyhour.com. But yes, have you been to Moores Creek Bridge? Because you're the one who told me about it.
Many years. Yeah, many years ago.
Okay. So I'm just trying to catch up with you on the places that you've been to. I think we've killed enough time. We've built up an audience here.
Probably.
Start the show. Give me a cue, and I'll get her going.
All right.
Ding.
Oh, you forgot the bell.
The bell.
Always open anyway.
Okay. Well, today we are bringing back a guest who's been on the show before. Alexander Lman is a British author, journalist, and historian. He's just come out with the third book in his trilogy on the House of Windsor, Power and Glory, Elizabeth II, and the Rebirth of Royalty. It comes out Tuesday. It is not out, at least not here in the U.S. yet. And it covers a period starting on VE Day, 1945, and goes to the coronation of Elizabeth in 1953. Alex, welcome to the program.
It's lovely to be on again. It's good to see you both. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
Excellent. Fantastic to have you here again. I don't have a cocktail today. Chris, I don't know if you have one.
What? Why don't you have a cocktail?
I don't have the bell. I don't have a cocktail. I'm off base. It's a tough day. Alex, do you have a cocktail?
My cocktail has run out, unfortunately.
Oh, no. Oh, bummer. Yes.
So I'm drinking alone. Thanks, guys.
Alex, the first two books of your trilogy each had a powerful conflict at the heart of them. So the first one is about the abdication of Edward at the center of it. The second book is focused on King George's reign during the Second World War. Here you get to the third book, and I wonder if you were maybe a little nervous that it might feel a little bit like an anticlimax.
Yeah, I mean, because I think when we spoke last, I mean, I think I said that I never envisaged the Crowning Crisis as being the beginning of a trilogy, because it seemed to me to be a really good self-contained story. But then I finished writing it and I thought there's too much good stuff that I've seen in the archives. There's too many dangling strands that I don't want to abandon. So I thought, right, well, I've got to write a second book. I've got to write the book that became Windsor War. And if you write two books like this, you think, oh, come on, there's obviously another book to be written. There's obviously more story to tell. I mean, maybe it's just I can't stop myself. But then, yeah, I mean, that was the thing I was wondering. And I thought, okay, so there's a royal wedding. There's VE Day. George VI dies. And then Elizabeth becomes queen. There's a coronation. I thought, okay, but these are just events. I mean, is there a story behind them? I mean, is there a narrative thread that's going to make it interesting? When I started doing my research and I thought, oh, there's so much here, and there's so much I didn't know while I was writing the earlier books. So you start to think, oh yeah, this stuff's fantastic, and it's going to make a really gripping and really interesting read. And I mean, it's been an absolute joy to write it. I just hope people enjoy reading it as much as I've enjoyed spending time with the characters.
Well, Alex, I think one of the things that maybe you could help us with, I think, Americans, they look at the war and they think, okay, we've got VE Day, we've won, everything's great, business is booming, and we all get on with the 50s and leave it to Beaver. But what's this? The situation's very different in Britain. So I think before we begin the conversation, it might be helpful to kind of let our viewers know what sort of shape is Britain in, and what's sort of the mood of the nation, and all, what's the groundwork.
I think the words Pyrrhic victory come to mind. But on the one hand, Britain has won World War II with obviously this assistance of its allies, namely and mainly America. But after the excitement of VE Day wears off, you've got a country that's been bombed to smithereens. There's no money. Churchill has been turfed out. And Clement Attlee and the Labour Party have come in on this socialist platform offering change and offering evolution, which of course went on to become enormously successful. But at the time, there was a sense of, what's all this about? What's this new scary government trying to do? But also there was a real sense that Britain had had its best days were behind it. And so obviously the royal family, in the shape of George VI, his wife Queen Elizabeth, and their children, had to overcompensate. And the difficulty is that George, who was never a particularly healthy man, he'd been so exhausted by what he'd had to do in World War II that he was completely worn out. And he just wasn't able to cope with a job anymore. So what I wanted to try and explore in the book is a sense of, I mean, the title is quite an ironic title. I mean, there's not much power. There's even less glory. So how can the royal family come into this absolutely dreadful situation, which gets worse, by the way? I mean, I'd like to point out to anyone watching this that it starts off quite badly and then it gets worse as the book goes on. Because also you've got the king's treacherous brother, which makes things really fun to write about and research. But also for the royal family, things are quite bad.
Well, we'll get into the king's brother, Edward, the Duke of Windsor. But just as one other piece of context, maybe you could give us kind of a sketch of who the main characters in this book are. And I think we probably know some, maybe not all of them. But for Americans who may not be intimately familiar with the lineage of the royal family, who are the main players in your book?
Well, I'd just like to say that the good thing about my book is that if you've read the earlier two books, you will know a lot of the characters, you'll know a lot of the story, you'll be coming in with quite a lot of preparation. If you haven't read the other two books, this one, I mean, all of them stand alone, but this one stands alone in a sense the best, because the narrative is so self-contained that you don't know anything about the royal family. But in order to have a kind of dramatis persona, you start off with the royal family itself. So you've got George VI, you've got the Queen Mother as she became Queen Elizabeth, you've got Princess Elizabeth, their eldest daughter, woman who will be queen, and you've got her wayward younger sister, Princess Margaret. And they are the main characters. What you've also got is you've got the man who used to be king, who was Edward VIII, and now is the Duke of Windsor, and he is carrying on with his wife, Wallis Simpson, who will not be given the HOH title, but he is so desperate for her to have. And you have a wide selection of royal courtiers, including Tommy Lascelles, who anyone who's seen The Crown might recognise him from the first two seasons of that, because he's very much a scene stealer there. And I think he's quite a scene stealer in my books as well, because you've got such caustic, this very British sense of stiff upper lip mixed with absolute contempt towards anyone who doesn't display it. And then you've got Walter Monckton, who appeared in the other two books, he was nominally Edward's lawyer, but he was also doubling up as a kind of advisor to the Crown as well. So what you've got, I mean, it's a lot of characters, and I mean, I apologise to anybody who comes to this book and doesn't look at the list of characters at the front, because it's not something I generally like doing, because I generally think that a narrative characters should be self-explanatory, and you should be able to know quite quickly who does what. But when you are dealing with dozens of people, and you have to know exactly what their function is and exactly how they'll relate to each other, I find it's really helpful just to have it written down, so you can keep saying, oh, so the Duke of Clarence, what's he do? And then you go back and you see. So I hope it's a public service, and I hope it's not supposed to be patronising, which it isn't intended as that.
Well, no, it's much appreciated, yes. So Alex, one of the, obviously Elizabeth becomes a much bigger character in this book than in the other two. And you start the book with a radio address that she gives while she's on, I guess, holiday, you would say. And you say that this radio address, she's addressing the Commonwealth, is the most famous public statement she ever made. So what is the statement? Why is it important? And why do you begin sort of introducing her in your book with this radio address?
Well, just to answer the last question first, Elizabeth is the heroine of the book, and I felt that after you know, she's in the other two books, but as a slightly marginal figure because she doesn't have much to do. Crown and Crisis, right. She's still a child. Windsor's at war. She's basically hanging around in Windsor Castle, being shut up while the war takes place. She's doing a bit of stuff in the army, but nothing too much. But this book, I mean, there's a reason why the subtitle is about her and about the rebirth of royalty. It's the way in which you see her emerge, become somebody in her own right. And what I was always very clear about was that the opening of the book had to be about her. And I thought, well, for 5 seconds, I thought, well, should I start with a coronation? Flashback from there. But I thought, no. There's a much better, much more interesting thing that she was involved in. She was in 1947 when she went to South Africa on this. I mean, you could call it a holiday, but it wasn't much of a holiday for anyone because it's a state visit and it's completely exhausting. And there's endless functions to be done, and it didn't actually go very well because George was so exhausted and so worn out by it all that he had a very bad time and lost his temper constantly. But on her 21st birthday, Princess Elizabeth made this speech in which she essentially promised that whether her reign be long or short, she would serve everybody in the Commonwealth to the best of her ability. And it's an incredibly powerful and very moving speech because not only did it essentially announce what was then going to happen, I mean, far sooner than she could have imagined, that her father died less than 5 years later and she became queen at the age of 25, but also that she went on to live for another 70 years. And, you know, Queen Elizabeth II was somebody who was so imbued with the concept of duty and for whom it was so absolutely vital that she believed in keeping the monarchy and keeping the traditions of Britishness upheld. And you can see a microcosm in this speech, which she's making as a 21-year-old woman. So not somebody who's got much knowledge of the world, not any knowledge at all of being queen at this point, because she's not queen. But I just find it incredibly moving. In fact, there are several times writing the book and now reading the book when I get quite choked up and quite emotional because you think to yourself, we're going beyond the usual pageantry, we're going beyond the usual formal addresses, and we're touching something quite extraordinary.
Well, I mean, just following on from that the reaction to that speech, were people surprised by it? Were they like, wow, this is not your usual sort of address? I mean, did it stand out then, or is it something we see her grow into?
What's so interesting is that we actually have, over this period, over the period that I've been setting the book in between 1936 and 1952, previously, royal addresses, as done from George V, are quite staid, quite boring things of somebody going on the radio and just saying, I hope you have had as good a Christmas as my family and I.
You do that really well, Alex.
Well done. I'm ready to extend.
I've listened to this stuff extensively. And but then, okay, so in 1936, we have Edward VIII going on the radio and saying, I have found it impossible to conduct my duty without the aid of a woman I love beside me. So he's out. And then you've got George VI doing all these broadcasts during World War II, again, which are completely unprecedented. Then you've got 1947, you've got Princess Elizabeth making this statement of absolute dedication and devotion to service. So you're thinking, things have really changed in the royal family. I mean, we see that today. We see the way in which, I mean, you just think about a few weeks ago, that Kate Middleton extraordinary video that she released. And you think, what happened in this period between 1936 and 1952, 1953? It's completely changed the idea of how we regard the royal family and how they have used the media and how they have broadcast and how they have used this form of mass communication to try and get across messages that once upon a time would have been taken a much, much longer time to get through to the public.
When the book starts, George is the king, and he's the king for most of the book. And as you said, Elizabeth is the heroine. And then there is Edward, the Duke of Windsor. And I'm not going to say he's the villain, but he certainly is as close to a villain as one has in this book. And man, he is constantly squeezing other people off the stage. He is hogging the limelight in your book. I think if you looked at line readings, he might be the character that gets sort of the most space. Did you, when you set out to write this book, did you expect Edward and his various machinations against the crown to be such a big part of the book? Or were you surprised as well?
No, it was no surprise to me at all, because after the crowning crisis of Windsor's War, I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by Edward. I mean, because I've been to Windsor Castle, I've read his correspondence. I've probably spent more time with that man going through his head in the last 6-7 years, just about anybody. And so he's like a character from Shakespeare. He's somebody who's absolutely awful, and I give him the rope to hang himself with. Because what I've done in all the books I've written is to use their own words as much as I can, because I feel that it is not up to me to paraphrase what these people say. They have to be allowed to speak for themselves. And the Duke of Windsor, over and over again, you see his crassness, his stupidity, his arrogance, his nastiness, his snobbery. You just think, what a lovely
But how
man.
do you really feel? You know?
Well, you say that he's not really the villain of the book. Well, spoiler alert.
You know, he seems to have a mode of self-regard and self-aggrandizement that reminds me of a recent and perhaps future president of the United States. Did that resemblance, comparison occur to you as well as you were working on this?
I think I mentioned it at one point in the book, actually. I say that this tendency he has to put himself up above everybody else and to be absolutely convinced that he is right at all times. If anyone stands against him, they're wrong. I was thinking, yeah, some of that stuff really sounds close. But also, I mean, whenever he was, because he wasn't allowed to make public speeches, but there was going to be a speech which he was going to make after his memoir, A King's Story, came out. And actually, that's one of my favourite chapters in the book, because I found the text of a speech that he never gave. And it's fascinating to read it, because you're just thinking to yourself, what on earth were you thinking? I mean, what on earth was going through your head with your brother being severely ill? He would have stood up in front of this audience of British publishers. He basically would have said, this book is so wonderful, and I am the most wonderful person in the world, and you're so lucky to be able to make lots of money from me. And I'm just thinking, I mean, the problem is that on the one hand, you have to remember that this man was a human being, but he wasn't some sort of character out of Shakespeare, out of some great 19th century novel. But on the other hand, you think to yourself, how could you have had so little self-knowledge and so much self-regard that you behave in this extraordinary way? So, yeah, I mean, I always knew he was going to be a big part of the book, because what I wanted to do was to tell 3 stories simultaneously. I wanted to tell the story of Princess Elizabeth, and she is the book's heroine. I wanted to tell the story of George VI and about what was happening there. And I wanted to tell the story of the Duke of Windsor. And villain is probably too strong a word, but he's certainly the antagonist. And he's certainly the person whose complete lack of anything resembling a moral compass is crucial to the story you're telling, because you've got these other people who are trying to do things for their country. You're trying actually to drag the situation out of this appalling mess that the Second World War has left people in. Then you have the Duke of Windsor, who's bored and he's angry and he feels that he's been spited. And there's literally nothing he doesn't contemplate doing. And you think to yourself, including at one point, essentially trying to commit treason and assume a regency if his brother is felt to be incapacitated. And you're thinking, why do you want to be king again? You didn't do a very good job last time.
Well,
So
Alex, I want you to pick up on that a bit, because it's easy to look at Edward and just say he's loathsome, yes, but it's also kind of laughable. But as you point out in the book, there are real constitutional issues that get raised during all this. So maybe, you can touch on that a little bit and say, like, why does he actually matter? Why is, I think about the Octavians, and why does his character matter to the kind of the historical narrative you're talking about?
Well, what's interesting is obviously in Britain, there was very little precedent, if any precedent, for a king to abdicate and then hang around, because you'd had forced abdications before the British royal family, what usually happened to be ex-king. They were quietly disposed of. I mean, look at Richard II, for instance. I mean, he didn't last very long after he abdicated. And I'm sure that various people, almost certainly including MI5, would have quite liked the Duke of Windsor just to quietly disappear and fall under a bus or whatever the royal equivalent is. But you can't do that. So, but while he carries on existing and going about, you have the difficult issue that obviously he's not going to disappear. He's going to carry on being this presence. And if he was to decide to come back to Britain and start causing trouble, then he's going to be quite a thorn in the side of not just the government, but also his brother and also potentially his niece as well. Because the difficulty was that the abdication crisis was a crisis for many different reasons. And one was that a situation of remarkable constitutional complexity had to be resolved in about 10 days. And so issues that would usually take months, possibly years to resolve, had to be done in literally a week and a half. So the whole basis on which Edward wasn't king anymore was quite shaky. And although he never actually tried to make himself king again, because we don't live in that kind of society, there was certainly the idea, as put forward by this friend of his and this semi-advisor, that if the opportunity was to arise, his brother was to become too ill to actually do the job, which is more or less what happened by the end, that somebody could come forward, a person who used to be king, and manage the show before Princess Elizabeth could take over. Now, this would have been absolutely appalling from every kind of perspective, because why on earth would a man who completely failed at being king and did nothing of any use while he was actually ruling the country, why would he come back and do a better job? The answer is he wouldn't do a better job. But his primary interest in taking on something like this, I mean, this is, in a sense, to his credit, if you like that, it wasn't so much for himself, although I'm sure he would have got his hands on as much cash as he would have done during that time, but it was because of Wallace Simpson. And of course, he was always so angry that she didn't get the recognition that he felt she deserved, that she wasn't given the HRH title, that she wasn't curtsied to by duchesses and so forth. And I think that if he had come back to Britain and he had actually tried to resume the throne in some way, the first thing he would have done would have been to have given her the title of Queen Wallace or something similar. So, I mean, we can count our lucky stars that didn't happen.
Yes.
Do you think that he really wanted to be king again? I mean, I read through this, and he wants money, he wants a position, but he doesn't seem to want to do any work. So does he really want to be king, or does he somehow want to be just recognized? And just to throw this out, does it never occur to the royal family that if they just maybe gave an inch here, that they might be able to satisfy him and kind of put this problem off to the side? Or are they just they're so stiff-necked that they cannot give an inch because Queen Elizabeth, who's married to King George, is so angry at the Duke for having abdicated and forced her husband to be king? She's not happy that she became queen and her husband became king. She's unhappy about it. I just, maybe you can just sort of dive into that any way you want.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, how the book begins is the Duke of Windsor is sitting in Paris after the aftermath of World War II, and he has no job. He has no function, he has no purpose, and he's bored. And there's a bit where essentially he's describing what he got up to in his average day, and you look at it and you think, what an astonishingly banal way to spend your life. But of course, you don't have a job, you don't have a function or a purpose, and you've got enough money to pay for servants and to pay for lavish hotels and flats and houses and so on. But you haven't got enough money to have a truly independent existence. So you're caught between two stools. And what Edward wanted, in addition to Wallace's recognition as HRH, was he wanted to be given a job by the British government that his brother would be responsible for getting him. And this job was a kind of ambassador without portfolio, that he could basically go off to America. He wouldn't have to do anything boring like actually being an ambassador or being a diplomat.
Actually working.
I mean, he literally proposed the idea that this house could be found for him in America. He could keep a good table and a good library and just introduce people to each other, i.e., what he wanted to do was something a bit like when he was Prince of Wales. He wanted to be able to have parties and somebody else pay for it all. And his brother, who we must recognise as being quite a kind-hearted character, despite everything his brother had done, went quite a long way to trying to make sure this scheme could actually happen, only to be told by the government, who were not particularly well disposed towards the royal family, because Clement Attlee and Bevan and people like that, they were not Churchill, they were not dyed-in-the-wool monarchists. They essentially said, no, you can't have two diplomats, you can't have two ambassadors to America, that's absurd. And so Edward wanted a job, and he tried to get a job, and the job was impossible. And after that, it became a case of his just looking around for other things to do. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say, Rick, that if he'd been given this sinecure, it might have shut him up. But then again, it might not have shut him up because
he might just keep on taking.
Yeah. I mean, what I always find so interesting about this period is that we have so much material, we have so much that you can look at. But there are always the what-if questions. There's also the questions about, well, is there some document, some letter that might clarify something that we ask questions about that has been lost or disposed of? And I think the answer is probably not, but you never know. And certainly, I mean, this might sound bizarre, but I've gone out of my way to try and find positive aspects of the Duke of Windsor.
And you still haven't done it.
No, there are bits in both Crown and Crisis and Windsor's a War where I explicitly say, this is where I think he was hard done by. This is where he was actually trying to do something useful. This is where I think we have to give him some credit. And I think even here, there's the odd moment I thought, well, actually, I mean, you're right. Would it have been so awful for Wallace to have been given an HRH title? No, I don't think it would have done. I think actually, if that has kept them quiet and shut them up, that was probably a price worth paying. But you're right. It was Queen Elizabeth's absolute loathing of him that stopped these things happening, because she really was the power behind the throne. And she was the person who, I mean, you can see letters from her, and these letters were absolutely vituperative. I mean, especially after her husband died, she explicitly blamed the Duke of Windsor for his death, because she said the stress that he placed him under with the abdication was what led to his untimely demise. And she was possibly right, but I would also say a very heavy smoking habit didn't help.
Yeah.
There is that.
So, Alex, I mean, so let's turn to that. You know, we've talked about Elizabeth a little bit, and I'm sure we'll come back to her. We've talked about Edward, but the third character, as you say in the book, is King. And you have a quote about him from the journalist James Cameron. He's talking about the King during this South African trip, and he says, "Down the path from the royal train walked a solitary figure in a blue bathrobe carrying a towel. The sea was a long way off, but he went. And all alone, on the great empty beach, between surging banks of the people who might not approach, the King of England stepped into the Indian Ocean and jumped up and down, the loneliest man at that moment in the world." And that quote really struck me, and I thought, how sad. Tell us a little bit more about him and why that journalist thought that about him. What was his sort of situation?
One of the reasons why I wanted to include that quote was, I mean, I've always viewed this trilogy cinematically. I mean, I've always viewed it in terms of images. And that, to me, is the kind of image that the way he describes it, you see everything. You see this combination of the isolation with these thousands of people who want to be near him and are not allowed to be near him. And I feel that you've got both his physical isolation, but also his emotional and mental isolation, because obviously he's a very shy man. I mean, he was not somebody who enjoyed the aspects of being king, because he had this speech impediment, which he got a bit better, but it was by no means cured. And he wasn't comfortable with the kind of public-facing aspects of the role, and especially after World War II, which brought out the best in him. He was now in a position where he had to do all these things he really didn't want to do. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that quote, because I remember reading it just thinking, you've got to feel so many things for a man in that situation. And feeling sorry for him is only part of it. There's also a sense of, I mean, it's that thing, it really is uneasy lies the head, isn't it? It's the sense that you've got this person who never wanted to be king, never expected to be king, and now he is king. And how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you spend your life knowing? But I mean, because if he hadn't been king and he'd just been the Duke of York, then that would have been fine. Because ultimately, there's not a lot expected from you if you're a royal brother. I mean, you do a few events and you smile.
Cut some ribbons.
But you don't actually have... I mean, that's how the Duke of Kent, the younger brother who died in World War II, how he was able to get away with so much bad behaviour in the 1920s, because nobody was watching very closely. Because if you're king, you are being watched all the time. You don't have a sense of being able just to go off duty for a few weeks or even a few months. You've got to be constantly watched by everybody. And so I would absolutely love one day to see a film or a TV series about that South African trip, because it's so full of incident and so full of these things happening.
Well, I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Alex Larman, who is the author of Power and Glory, Elizabeth II, and the Rebirth of Royalty. And we haven't talked about Elizabeth and her courtship with Philip, and we'll get to that. But just to follow up, you were saying you'd love to see a movie about the South African trip. I would love to see a movie about Elizabeth's time in Malta, when she was a young mother, and her husband has been made, I think, initially the second in command, or eventually the commander of a British naval ship, not a U.S. naval ship. And she goes off to live in Malta, which is where he's based out of. And she is basically, and leaves the kids behind, right?
Yeah.
Leaves the kids behind with a nanny. But she's basically just off being a young housewife, woman, no royal responsibilities. I'd like to know more about what happened to her during that period.
Well, I find what I've always been really interested in, and I suppose I've tried to do this in all the trilogy, is to explore the heightened psychological states you get to of ordinary people leading extraordinary lives in extraordinary circumstances. And obviously, you could say that if you're a member of a monarchy, you're never ordinary, and that's a fair point. But yes, what's it like to be Princess Elizabeth and to have a life of constant scrutiny, knowing you're going to be queen, increasingly thinking you're going to be queen quite soon, when all of a sudden you're offered this chance to go off and have a normal life? And you want to have a normal life, and you go to Malta, and you can actually start to be, you can be with your husband who you love very much, and actually start to think that you've got having a normal marriage, where you're not this constant object of scrutiny. And what's so frustrating for us at the moment is that it's pretty much accepted that Elizabeth kept a diary for most, if not all, of her life. Nobody has ever seen this diary. So it is sitting somewhere, waiting for, I presume, the authorised biographer of Elizabeth II to be given access to it. But it'd be so fascinating to see what exactly she was thinking, because one thing about her is that we, in a sense, we have to project our own images of the person that she was. We know that she was dutiful, we know that she was committed to both the institution of the monarchy and her own role within it. But the question we have to ask is, what were you thinking? I mean, were you thinking when you were in Malta this could last? Did you think that this was something perhaps that was going to go on for any amount of time, or did you know it was always going to be a very short-lived period? Because it's a cruelty, isn't it, that you've been shown exactly how happy you could be if you didn't have to go back to public service, if you didn't have to go back to being this figure who's going to be scrutinised for the rest of her life. But then the counter-argument to this is service was important to her. That was the pact that she made on her 21st birthday. That was what she offered the Commonwealth. And just because you've been given this brief glimpse of freedom and the lack of responsibility doesn't mean that you can't go back and think, right, well, I know that my duty is greater than my own personal happiness.
So as one of the people who've traveled with me before or talked to me, they know that one of the things that I've always been very, very interested in is sort of the Commonwealth and the position of the Commonwealth as it relates to the crown. The Commonwealth seems to be something that's important to Elizabeth and the royal family. What did the people in the Commonwealth think of her? What was their reaction to her address? And is there just a misconnect here between what the royal family thinks the Commonwealth is and what's happening as the empire is dissolving, or where does that all fit? Because I guess an example I use is, as many people know, my daughter's at University of Toronto, and when the Queen passed away, I said, talked to her on the phone. I said, "So did you watch the funeral? Did you and your friends watch the funeral on TV?" And she said, "Well, no. Why?" And I thought how striking it is that, 30, 40 years after Elizabeth becomes queen, people in the empire are like, yeah, whatever. It's another day at the office.
I mean, I could just I answer that question. I mean, my own experience was I was sitting in a pub in London, and at this stage, I was fairly sure that the Queen's death was going to be announced. Excuse me, any moment. And when, of course, it was announced, me and my friend were the only people who were particularly moved or affected by it. I mean, everybody else was just, that's some item on the news. Yeah. I think that's a reflection of the way in which the royal family is perhaps not as important in people's lives as it was. And you have to ask, well, when did that happen? When did that change? But I mean, to look at the wider Commonwealth, there's certainly the case that you've got a sense in the 1940s and the 1950s that the Second World War has changed the deal that the Commonwealth had with Britain itself. That so many people have fought on the side of the Allies, they've gone off and done their duty, they've gone off and died for the British Empire, that you start to think to yourself, well, are we owed a bit more? I mean, are we less now the adoring subjects, and are we more stakeholders in some kind of future where we go on together? And so things like the South African trip, the South African trip, you can see that there's obviously an enthusiasm. There's also, with the nationalists, a real contempt towards the royal family, a real contempt towards the British. And so there's that tension, isn't there, between, on the one hand, you're trying to keep the dream alive. But one thing that I wasn't able to write about in the book as much as I wanted to was about India and about partition. Because obviously that is the big international event. Yeah. But it's not one that is directly affecting the royal family. So it's always a very difficult thing in these books, because you've got to obviously talk about what's going on that isn't immediately relevant to your central narrative. But it would be so easy to write a book like this as a social history of Britain in the 40s and early 50s. Right. And you think to yourself, no, you've got to keep it tightly focused. And so you simply can't include the kind of stories that you want to include.
Do you think that she was aware that sort of the ground was shifting underneath her feet when she becomes queen, or was there...
I think that she knew that the world was changing. I think the World War II changed everything forever. I think that all that the royal family could do after that was to adapt to a changing world. But I think there was also a sense that, I mean, all three of them, the Duke of Windsor, Elizabeth, and George VI, they've all been affected by what happens in the war. They've all changed. But it's how they deal with the new settlement and the new order that I find so interesting to explore, because bluntly speaking, Elizabeth will deal with it. She understands there is a new world, but a different kind of monarchy is called for, hence the rebirth of royalty. Sorry, I was got a pouring cough for some reason. George
You're
VI,
allergic to us.
must be. And George VI is somebody who has essentially this tension of his difficulty, whereby he is uncomfortable with being king anyway. Then the Duke of Windsor, he wants there to be change, but as long as it benefits him. So it's all about duty and selfishness. And I mean, I don't think it's spoiling too much to say that power and glory, I use it as an ironic title, because there's not much power, there's even less glory.
Hey, so let's talk a little bit about Elizabeth and Philip. You devote a fair amount of the book to their romance. I have so many questions. Maybe I'll just ask them all, and then you can decide what you want to answer. But who is Philip when they meet? How is he regarded by her family? And is he? One of our viewers asked, was he faithful? Did he love her, or was he unfaithful to her and just sort of marrying her because his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, kind of wanted to make this deal for his family? I mean, tell us a little bit about the story of Philip and Elizabeth, or Elizabeth and Philip, as would be the correct order.
Sure. Well, it was one of those funny things because I thought I knew the story, and I thought it was going to be part of the book that I had to retell just to contextualize stuff. And I thought this is going to be something that my heart's not really in. I've got to have a love story because it's what went on. I want to get back to all the shenanigans and all the conspiracies and all the Duke of Windsor's awfulness. But actually, what I didn't know was a lot about Philip and about who he was and what he came from. Because, like anybody in Britain of a certain age, I always assumed that Prince Philip was this very gruff, quite racist, quite cantankerous character who basically was provocative. He liked causing trouble. You go back to his, if you will, his origin story, and he came from this Greek aristocratic family, but he arrived in Britain as a child, and he came from this family where there wasn't anything like the status or the money that you would have expected for him to grow up to the woman who was going to become queen. But what he was brave and he was charismatic. And so after his naval service, he was moving in kind of circles, obviously with his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, being very much this panda figure. Panda as in P-A-N-D-E-R, as opposed to a fluffy, cuddly animal, which I don't think Mountbatten was. But he was somebody who was very much bringing him into the kind of circles where he was going to meet the future queen, and they were going to fall in love, and it was going to become... I mean, it was not necessarily a popular match with the royal family. I mean, George VI liked him because of the shared naval background, but neither Queen Elizabeth nor her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, had any particular regard for Philip, because there's a line that if they'd been drawing up a first 11 of possibles, he wouldn't have been on the list, because he wasn't a leading European aristocrat. His sisters had all married people who were, if not Nazis, they were German aristocracy and Nazi adjacent, shall we say. And there was the sense that, I know, there being Nazi adjacent went on quite a lot during this period. And so Philip himself was somebody, because he wasn't quite plain-spoken and quite unvarnished, he'd go up to these, if you like, auditions at Balmoral in Scotland, and he wouldn't toe the line. I mean, he wouldn't be dressed appropriately, he wouldn't speak appropriately. One of my favourite stories is that he had to wear a kilt. He felt very self-conscious by wearing this kilt, so he mock curtsied to the king, and this went down very badly indeed. But what I found myself doing, and it's interesting because what I do, because I think every writer does, is I read every review that anyone puts on Amazon or Goodreads with enormous interest, because I'm absolutely fascinated to see what people think of the books. And one person said that Philip comes across as badly as you'd expect he does. And I thought, oh dear. I mean, I really didn't intend his presentation to be negative, because actually I ended up quite liking him. And my favourite story about him is when, just before he and Elizabeth got married, there was a display of all the various gifts that had been sent over. And Gandhi sent over his tray cloth, and it was on display. And Queen Mary saw it and said, "Oh, horrible man! He sent over his loincloth. Oh, how revolting!" And Philip said, "No, it isn't revolting. I don't think it's horrible at all. Gandhi is a great man. He's a very great man." And to say this in 1947, at the height of partition, and Gandhi was quite a controversial figure, to this woman who you know doesn't like you, you don't care. And you think to yourself, why am I going to sacrifice my principles and my beliefs for the sake of tact? And you think, yeah, good on you. That was actually quite a courageous thing.
No, one of the things about him that really struck me is he was kind of badly treated by some of the members of her family. And I would have thought that he and she, Queen Elizabeth, might have had that in mind 30 years later when they have a young woman who's joining the royal family for the first time. And they seem to have completely forgotten this, or at least not applied the lessons that one might have learned from that.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because obviously, so many people watching and listening to this, I'm sure, will know the story from The Crown. And while we don't have time to go into it, was The Crown factually accurate or not discussion, certainly presentation of the relationship between Philip and Diana in that alternates wildly between a kind of, closeness and between a sort of almost Philip threatening her. And you think to yourself, what did Philip actually think of Diana? I mean, instinctively, you would have thought that he would have more in common with somebody like Camilla, because there are people who are outgoing, sporty, like riding and stuff like that. Diana wasn't like that. But on the other hand, Philip was somebody, I suppose, who, after initially being very anti the whole royal family, being anti all the protocol and anti all the various things that had to be done, I think as time went on, he saw himself as the custodian of it. And
Drink the Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Well, but that's it, isn't it? If you become part of an institution, after a while, that is your life. I mean, you can't be fighting it forever if you're in it for 50 years. But I do find it fascinating. And I mean, what's been frustrating for me is that this is the end of a trilogy. And although I'm sure I'm going to write books that involve the royal family or a royal family adjacent again, I can't imagine following this particular narrative into the present day, because I don't think that I'm the person to tell that story. But there's so many parts of the story I'd love to delve into. And Philip and his relationship with Diana is one of them.
So, Alex, another one of the relationships I think that's important, and maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about, is the relationship of Churchill with Elizabeth. Because, you know, as you point out at the beginning, let's just say it's not a warm relationship, but that changes. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how it starts and what Churchill is thinking, and take it from there?
Sure. Well, actually, I mean, one technical thing at this point is, for all of my books, I've had to cut loads of material. And in every single case, you're not cutting it because it's libelous or because it's hurtful or even because it's boring. You cut it because you have to concentrate on moving the narrative forward. And if you've basically got material that is repeating what you're saying elsewhere, just in more depth and more detail, it has to go. And one of the main things I really regret cutting was a lot of stuff that's very late in the book about the relationship between the new Queen Elizabeth and Churchill and their friendship, because it's an absolutely fascinating subject. And I would have loved to have kept that material in. And actually, it was one of the few things that I thought too strong, but I disagreed with my editor about, because I thought I really want to know more about this, and I'm sure other readers do as well. But his argument is, we know what's happening. We don't need this level of detail. But essentially what happened was that Princess Elizabeth and Churchill had a perfectly polite relationship. There was no particular knowledge. And after George VI died, sort of suddenly, although not quite unexpectedly, Churchill was absolutely inconsolable, because he had a very good friendship with George VI. And when he was told, well, you are going to have the joy of serving the Queen now, he said, I do not know her, she is only a child. So it's not the most auspicious beginning that the relationship can have. But then what happened quite soon is that obviously Churchill has been re-elected by this point, and Labour have been forced out of government after just over one term. And Churchill is quite old. I mean, he's not the figure he was in World War II. It's 7 years after the end of World War II. So he wasn't young then. So he's quite an old man, and he's had strokes, and his health is not brilliant, but he's still seen on both sides of the Atlantic as well as the major political figure of the time. So Elizabeth having him as her mentor is obviously quite a useful thing. I mean, to have him as your first Prime Minister was quite the thing. To have Liz Truss as your last Prime Minister.
I was going to say your last one. We know where that went.
I was going to say it's really a reductio ad absurdum there. But anyway, so relationship between Churchill and Elizabeth was excellent. And we used to go for these hour-long meetings together, the traditional things that the King or Queen would always have for the Prime Minister. And one of my favourite stories is there would always be gales of laughter coming out of the room. And Churchill would go dressed as if he might have been dressed in the sort of Edwardian era. He'd go formally attired in a top hat, which, I mean, even by then was massively anachronistic. Right. And at one point, so he came out, and one of the courtiers said, "So what do you talk about? I mean, what do you laugh about all the time?" He said, "Oh, just the racing." It's just such a nice story, because the friendship between the two of them was deep and sincere, and I think that I mean, it's a fact that the Queen attended his funeral, which obviously protocol would have dictated that you never ever did, because it wasn't the done thing. And of course, I mean, I know she also attended Margaret Thatcher's, but again, there is precedent there. But certainly, yeah, I mean, the relationship was one of my favourite things to write about in the book, and I just wish I could have got those sort of 5,000 words back.
You essentially said he fell in love with her.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that it isn't a sexual love. It's a love based on the sort of almost Arthurian ideals that Churchill subscribed to all of his life. He genuinely felt there was something wonderful and untouched and absolutely unique about this new queen, and he wanted to try and make sure he could do everything he could to make her life better and easier. And I think that he did. I mean, I think that he certainly had his faults at this stage as prime minister. I mean, he wasn't a consequential prime minister at this point, but if he had done anything to help her and to make her life better, then that has to be seen as a real achievement and a real accomplishment.
So, are you up, Rick, or am I?
I'll go up. So let me. I just want to. There's so much more we could talk about, but I wonder if there are any lessons in this book for King Charles, for the potentially future King William. Anything that you would say that if they read this book, that you would want them to take away from it?
Well, obviously, 2024 has been a terrible year for the royal family so far. I mean, they've been absolutely racked with problems. And, I mean, it's not so much the Windsors at war, it's more the Windsors in a constant state of panic and devastation and illness. So, I mean, one day somebody's going to write a brilliant book about what's going on at the moment. It's not going to be me, but I look forward to reading it if I'm still alive by then. But what I would say the lessons from this period are, I mean, not just from this book, but from the other two as well, is that if you are a member of the monarchy, you have to act with transparency, with dignity, and with integrity. Because if you don't, you're going to get found out. And you're going to get found out quicker than you think you are as well. Because what I've always had difficulty with is the idea that you have to kowtow to the monarchy because it is the monarchy. And this is what I think separates me from the vast majority of royal biographers and historians in Britain, because most of them come at this from the perspective that the royal family is intrinsically a good thing, as I don't. I don't believe the royal family is a particularly good thing. I think it's probably quite a bad thing in a lot of regards. But what I think it also has is a nobility at its best. It has an integrity and a dignity as an institution. But I would have no interest in seeing it swept away and replaced by a presidency or anything like that, because Britain is not a country intrinsically suited to this kind of stuff. So what I would hope is that anyone who actually sits down and reads these books, and I know at least one member of the royal family has, I'm not at liberty to say who they are, but I thought, okay, yeah, fair enough. And it's quite interesting because I wonder what they thought and what they would actually say, because my intention has always been not to editorialize, not to try and say, well, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. And I mean, it's been interesting that people can see my contempt for Duke of Windsor a mile off, but there is no contemporary Duke of Windsor figure. I mean, you can say what you like about William or Harry or Charles or any of the rest of them, but not one of them has the degree of selfishness and the degree of absolute, blinkeredness that Edward displayed. So I just hope that people can read the books. And I mean, we're not talking about distant history here. We're talking about stuff that was going on. There will be people alive who can remember all this stuff. So we're not talking about something which has been consigned to the annals of medievalism or something like that. And all I can hope is that, I mean, the books are... I've spent years researching them. I mean, I've always made sure that every single story, no matter how outrageous it sounds, can be double sourced. It can be taken back to original documents or original letters or something like that. And you think to yourself, I hope that the books stand up as examples of interesting, readable, and valuable history.
Well, so Alex, I mean, this is, you've kind of touched on a little bit about this, but I'd like to get some more of your thoughts. For a lot of, I think it's safe to say for a lot of Americans, the royal family it's fun. You can visit the castles, you can buy the tea towel. The Crown is a great show. But they maybe don't understand or appreciate, kind of its constitutional role and why it actually matters beyond, the splendor, I guess, of it. but it seems to me that Elizabeth sort of kind of defines what the royal family is going to look like, and she's seen Britain through some pretty important points in its history. So maybe talk about your perceptions of her as an effective monarch and what she's done to either change the monarchy. Why does why does this story matter beyond it's a great story and it's entertaining?
Well, I suppose that there's two reasons. The first reason is because you have this, I think and hope, Shakespearean quality to these characters of people being thrust into history and how they deal with events which both overwhelm them and they have to prove themselves equal to or unequal to. So that purely, as a narrative, I think, has its own interest. But on a wider constitutional level, I mean, why does the British monarchy still matter? The British monarchy doesn't have any ability to stop things being done. I mean, there has never been a royal veto being exercised. And actually, one of the interesting things about King Charles was that it was believed that he would at times exercise some sort of veto. But actually, the first thing he said when he became king is, I'm no longer going to become an interventionist monarch. I'm going to become somebody who fulfills the same role that my mother did, i.e. I do what I'm told. But the thing is about the monarchy is that it continues to exist for a reason. There has never been in Britain a really successful Republican challenge. I mean, apart from, of course, Cromwell, but that was a while ago. But certainly, but in present day times, I mean, the role of monarchy is certainly not what it was. And there is certainly no sense that it is actually an important part of the Constitution, but it is also part of a Constitution that is there. And I mean, that sounds almost banal, but in fact, it's something that the integrity of the monarchy in Britain is such that if it was not to exist, people would sit fast and there isn't anything to replace it with. Now, obviously, America has done very well without a monarchy. I don't think there's going to be any great demand that if and when William becomes king, that he decides to bring America back into the fold. Though you never know. If you get
Chris is hoping for that. Yeah.
I was going to say, if you get a particularly bad,
hope springs eternal.
if you get a particularly bad result of the presidential election this year, you may be asking for it. But
could be. Well, Alex Larman, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, A Power and Glory, which is the third book of a trilogy, Elizabeth II and the Rebirth of Royalty. We so appreciate your being on and sharing your view with us, and suggest to people that there is a lot more to this. If you're interested in it, buy it. One of our viewers, Cheryl Holt, says that you should write a book about Elizabeth and Churchill. I know you've already got two books under contract out there. So, there's an idea for a third one, unless it's one of the two you're already doing.
No, it's not. But I mean, I would quite like to write that book. So let's see if there's anything in it.
Okay. Thank you, Alex, so much for joining
Cheryl
us.
will buy a copy.
Yes, you sold one
Thanks,
copy
Alex.
already.
Precisely. Pre-order it now.
Okay, Chris, we're done talking about royalty. We are into an encore episode next week, and I thought I'd bring back a program that we actually have brought back before, but we're going to be a month out from D-Day, so we're going to bring back our D-Day special with Giles Milton, Joe Balkowski, Craig Simons. It's a 90-minute show. If you haven't seen it, great dive,
It's kind of hard
fun
to top
dive
that cast.
into D-Day. Yeah, that was a super show. We're going to have some more D-Day programming coming up as well. We have 2 weeks of encore episodes, and then when we come back, we'll have some more D-Day programming. We'll be over there. We'll be in Normandy. They'll probably have us separated into various parts of Normandy so that we won't be together, but we'll be, we'll feel the vibes of being closer together.
Not related to Normandy at all, but this is important. Todd, if you are still watching, yes, you can send me chowder anytime you want to. Okay.
Okay. Yes. We get that for Todd. Hey, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Twitter. Listen to our podcast. You can back us on patreon.com and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.